Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Kahun Papyrus Crocodile-Dung Contraceptive. In a mud brick town beside a pyramid in the Fayum, sometime around 1825 BCE, a woman crushes something dark into a paste by lamplight and mixes it with honey. The something dark is crocodile dung. What she is holding is not a folk superstition scribbled by a quack. It is a prescription copied into the oldest document devoted to women's medicine anywhere on Earth. We call it the Kahun Gynecological Papyrus. The archaeologist Flinders Petrie pulled it from the ruins of the pyramid town of Lahun in 1889, and today it sits in the Petrie Museum in London. It dates to the reign of Amenemhat III in Egypt's 12th dynasty, which makes it roughly 200 years older than the far more famous Ebers Papyrus. Across 34 surviving sections, it deals with fertility, pregnancy, gynecological complaints, and contraception. And one of its contraceptive recipes calls for a pessary of crocodile dung, packed into the body as a barrier against pregnancy. Here is the strange part. The method was not entirely nonsense. Dung packed at the cervix could form a crude physical plug, and the Egyptians were reaching, blindly, toward the idea of barrier contraception. But crocodile dung is alkaline, which raises the internal pH in exactly the wrong direction, and the honey mixed with it may have done more good than the dung by being mildly antibacterial. Compare it to another Egyptian recipe, the acacia gum pessary from the Ebers Papyrus. Acacia gum ferments into lactic acid, which is a genuine, mild spermicide. So the same civilization stumbled onto something that half worked and something that mostly did not, side by side. Why crocodile? In Egyptian belief, the crocodile belonged to Sobek, a god tied to the fertile power of the Nile, so the ingredient carried a symbolic charge as well as a supposed medical one. The papyrus even records a pregnancy test in which a woman urinated on bags of barley and emmer wheat. If the grain sprouted, she was said to be pregnant. When researchers actually tried this in 1963, it flagged pregnancy correctly around 70% of the time. Think about what this really means. A literate, mathematically sophisticated civilization, one that could align a pyramid to the cardinal directions, was also prescribing feces as reproductive medicine, with no concept of the infections it could cause. The mainstream reading is that this was practical barrier medicine dressed in Sobek symbolism. A more skeptical reading warns against the modern habit of insisting it must have worked. Either way, the woman by the lamp was following the best written medical advice her world could offer, and that advice began with crocodile dung. Number 2. The Etruscan human tooth dental bridges. A goldsmith bends over a workbench in central Italy, sometime in the 7th century BCE, and rivets a human tooth into a thin band of gold. The tooth is not the customer's. It came from someone else's mouth, possibly someone already dead. When the band is finished, it will be fitted into the smile of a living woman. These are Etruscan dental appliances, and they are among the oldest dental prosthetics ever found. They come from the Etruscan heartland of modern Tuscany, Lazio, and Umbria, and they span roughly the 7th to the 2nd centuries BCE. Only about 20 authenticated examples survive in museum collections around the world, and the definitive modern catalog was assembled by the scholar Marshall Becker, who corrected a long list of 19th century misidentifications. Each appliance is a loop or band of high-purity gold that anchored replacement teeth to the natural teeth still standing in the jaw. The sourcing is what unsettles people. Some appliances reuse the wearer's own extracted teeth. Others use teeth harvested from other humans. And at least one famous example used the tooth of an ox, cut and pinned to imitate a pair of human incisors. The gold itself was soft, too soft to survive hard chewing, which tells us most of these bridges were not really for eating. They were for appearance and for status, and many come from the burials of women, worn in life as a mark of wealth, or fitted for the grave so the dead could enter the afterlife with a complete smile. The skill behind them came from the same gold-working tradition that produced Etruscan granulation jewelry, some of the finest metalwork of the ancient Mediterranean. The Romans very likely inherited these banding techniques, and the early Roman law code known as the 12 Tables, from around 450 BCE, already refers to gold buried with the dead in the mouth. Reusing the teeth of the dead also foreshadows something much later and much grimmer. The trade in so-called Waterloo teeth in the early 1800s, when teeth pulled from battlefield corpses filled the dentures of the living. There are competing ways to read these objects. The straightforward interpretation is that they were functional prosthetics for people who had lost teeth. A second reading treats them as pure status display, gold jewelry for the mouth. A third holds that many were funerary only, made for the grave rather than for daily life. What none of the theories can soften is the core image. A wealthy Etruscan smile, gleaming with gold, was in some cases literally built out of other people's mouths, and then carried down into the tomb. Number 3. The Roman Tersorium. A German prisoner, held in a Roman gladiator barracks, is left alone for a moment near the latrine. He picks up the communal toilet sponge, a sea sponge fixed to a wooden handle, and forces it down his own throat to choke himself to death, rather than be marched into the arena. The philosopher Seneca tells this story in his 70th moral letter, and it is our clearest proof of what the object was and how ordinary it was in Roman life. The Romans called it a tersorium, or in a Greek-derived word, a xylospongium, literally a sponge on a stick. It was used to wipe after defecation, and in a public latrine it was shared. Between users it was rinsed in a channel of running water, or in a bucket of vinegar or salt water set nearby. Vinegar and salt water are mild disinfectants, but they come nowhere near killing the parasites, and bacteria passed from one human gut to the next. And the Roman public latrine, the Fullonica, seated many people side by side on a stone bench with no partitions at all, over a continuous channel of flushing water, with a shallow gutter of clean water running along the floor at their feet, which is where the sponge was very likely dipped. We can still walk through these latrines at Ostia, at Pompeii, at Herculaneum, and at the fort of Housesteads on Hadrian's Wall. And the science built on them is damning. The paleoparasitologist Piers Mitchell of Cambridge published a study in 2016 showing that all the celebrated Roman sanitation, the baths, the sewers, the toilets, did not reduce intestinal parasites at all. Whipworm, roundworm, and dysentery stayed common, and in some places may even have increased. A shared sponge, wiped across gut after gut, is exactly the kind of object that would carry those infections along the bench. The wealthy may have escaped the worst of it using their own private sponge, or wool, or moss. The shared sponge was the public option for everyone else. And Romans did not have soap. They cleaned the body with oil and a scraper, which meant that hand hygiene after using the latrine was close to non-existent. There are gentler and harsher ways to read the tersorium. One view treats it as a reasonable attempt at hygiene with the tools available. Another sees it as an amplifier of disease, quietly spreading infection through the very system meant to carry waste away. A third points out that its use was split by class, that the horror fell hardest on the poor. What stays with you is the intimacy of it. In the empire most famous for its engineering, a single sponge on a stick carried the diseases of strangers down a crowded stone bench. Number 4. The Roman Gladiator-Blood epilepsy cure. The fight is over, and a young gladiator is dying on the sand. But someone is kneeling at the edge of the arena, waiting, and as the blood runs, they catch it and drink it while it is still warm. This person is not a spectator gone mad. They are a patient, following a medical prescription, because in the Roman world, the fresh blood of a slain gladiator was a recognized treatment for epilepsy. The elder Pliny describes it plainly in his Natural History in the 1st century CE. Epileptics, he writes, drink the blood of gladiators as though from living cups, and he calls the practice revolting, even as he records it as real. The physician Celsus, in his work on medicine, notes that some sufferers drank the warm blood from the cut throat of a fallen fighter. Later writers, including Aretaeus of Cappadocia and Alexander of Tralles, mention human blood, or even the liver, as remedies for the same disease. The logic behind it was a kind of sympathetic magic wearing the costume of medicine. Epilepsy was called the sacred disease, and it terrified people. A gladiator was a young man in the prime of physical strength, killed suddenly and violently, and the belief held that his vital force, his life spirit, could pass into the drinker through his fresh blood. The liver, thought to be a seat of vitality, was sometimes eaten raw for the same reason. When gladiatorial combat was finally restricted in the 4th and 5th centuries CE, the practice did not simply vanish. It reportedly shifted to the blood of executed criminals instead. Modern historians of medicine, notably Ferdinand Peter Moog and Axel Karenberg, trace this so-called consumption of gladiator blood through the Roman sources and beyond, and found that it echoed forward for centuries. In early modern Europe, the sick still gathered at execution scaffolds to drink the blood of the beheaded, in a direct descendant of the Roman belief. There is, of course, no physiological basis for any of it. Iron from blood does nothing for seizures, and drinking raw human blood or eating raw liver carries a very real risk of fatal infection. The competing explanations all sit within the same dark frame. One reads it as sympathetic magic, the idea that strength can be transferred by consuming the strong. Another sets it inside the era's humoral medicine, where fluids were thought to carry vitality. A third treats it as pure folk desperation in the face of a disease no one could treat. Epilepsy carried such heavy stigma that sufferers were isolated and desperate enough to try anything. And so the Roman arena, already a machine for spectacle and death, doubled as a pharmacy, sending the sick to the sand to drink the dying. Number 5. The Tyrian purple dye vats. Approach the Phoenician city of Tyre from downwind, and you would smell it long before you saw it. Row upon row of open stone vats, packed with the crushed bodies of sea-snails, left to rot in the sun for days. Out of that stench came the single, most prestigious color in the ancient world, a purple worth more by weight than gold. Tyrian purple was made from the mucus of predatory sea snails, mainly 2 species, Bolinus brandaris and Hexaplex trunculus. The dye chemical 6,6'-dibromoindigo was locked inside a gland in the snail's body. To release it, workers had to crack the shells or milk the glands, then leave the flesh to putrefy in vats for days, because the dye only developed through that reeking decomposition. The smell was so overpowering that dye works were pushed to the edges of cities, downwind of everyone else, and the scale of slaughter was staggering. It took something like 10,000 to 12,000 snails to dye the trim of a single garment. What you got in return was almost supernatural for an ancient dye. The color ranged from deep crimson to rich violet, and unlike nearly every other dye of the age, it did not fade in sunlight. It actually deepened. That permanence, combined with the labor, made it fantastically expensive. A single pound of dyed wool could cost the equivalent of years of a laborer's wages. Roman sumptuary laws restricted purple to the elite, and eventually full Tyrian purple was reserved for the emperor alone, which is where we get the phrase, born to the purple. The industry finally collapsed after the fall of Constantinople in 1453, broke the imperial monopoly. The evidence is still in the ground. At Tyre and Sidon, ancient production left behind mounds of crushed murex shells that can run to millions of shells, piled up over centuries. The dye appears in the Hebrew Bible as the sacred colors techelet and argaman. And there is a chemical twist. Because Hexaplex trunculus can yield blue as well as purple, Depending on how much light hits the dye during processing, a genuine photochemical reaction the ancients exploited without understanding it. In 1909, the chemist Paul Friedlander finally worked out the dye's structure, and he needed thousands of snails to isolate a tiny sample. The theories here are less about mystery than about meaning. One thread follows the economics, the way scarcity and labor built a color into a symbol of absolute power. Another follows its religious weight in the ancient Near East. A third is the experimental archaeology now recreating the vats and confirming just how foul the process was. And the paradox at the center never loosens. Emperors robed themselves in the grandest color humanity had ever made, and it was born in tanks of decomposing snails. Number 6. The Durrington walls feasting coprolites. Somewhere in the chalk near Stonehenge lies a fossilized human turd, roughly 4,500 years old, and inside it are the eggs of the worms its owner swallowed at a feast. That single object connects the raising of the most famous monument in Britain to a very intimate kind of disgust. The site is Durrington Walls, an enormous Neolithic henge settlement, a little under 3 kilometers northeast of Stonehenge, occupied around 2500 BCE. Archaeologists interpret it as the seasonal home of the people who built the great Sarsen phase of Stonehenge itself. In 2019, a team led by Lisa Marie Shillito of Newcastle University analyzed 19 coprolites, that is, fossilized pieces of feces, recovered from the site's rubbish midden. Some were human and some were from dogs, and 5 of them contained parasite eggs. The parasites tell a precise and grim story. Several coprolites held the eggs of capillariid worms, and their presence points to people eating the raw or undercooked internal organs, the lungs and liver of infected animals, most likely cattle. One held the egg of a fish tapeworm. The fact that both human and dog coprolites carried these parasites suggests that scraps and offal from the feasts were shared with the dogs at the settlement, and the animal bones at Durrington back up the picture of feasting. There are huge quantities of cattle and pig bones, many showing signs of roasting and of rapid, wasteful consumption, the marks of a party rather than a careful household meal. The context makes it richer still. Isotope analysis of the cattle bones shows the animals were driven to the site from across Britain, some from hundreds of kilometers away, hauled in for great gatherings that seem to have peaked in midwinter, aligned with the solstice orientation of Stonehenge. The coprolites survived because the chalky midden neutralized the acidity that would normally destroy them, protecting the parasite eggs for millennia. The excavation of these houses came out of Mike Parker Pearson's Stonehenge Riverside Project, which uncovered some of the best preserved Neolithic dwellings in the country, and the parasite study itself appeared in the journal Parasitology. The interpretations mostly agree on the essentials, with a few open threads. The mainstream reading is that communal feasting on undercooked offal was the direct root of infection, the price of the gatherings themselves. The archaeological reading ties it to the ritual purpose of those midwinter assemblies. The loose thread is that inland fish tapeworm egg, which hints at imported freshwater fish, or the movement of people carrying the parasite. The image that lingers is simple and physical. The people who raised Stonehenge left behind their own feces, still carrying the worms they caught while feasting in its shadow. Number 7. The Herculaneum Cardo 5 sewer. Under a street in a town buried by Vesuvius, researchers spent years hauling up sack after sack of compacted human sewage, 750 sacks in all, nearly a ton of 2,000-year-old excrement. It sounds like the least appealing job in archaeology. It turned out to be one of the richest windows into Roman daily life ever opened. Herculaneum was buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, but unlike Pompeii, which was smothered in ashfall, Herculaneum was sealed under hot pyroclastic surges that preserved organic material in astonishing detail. Beneath a block of apartments and shops known as the Insula Orientalis II, a large cesspit ran under the street called Cardo 5. Crucially, this sewer had no connection to the sea, so waste did not drain away. It simply accumulated, turning the pit into an enormous septic tank fed by the latrines and drains of the buildings above. Around 2011, work connected to the Herculaneum conservation project, with analysis by the Oxford researcher Mark Robinson, recovered that vast deposit of desiccated organic sediment, and it was essentially compacted human excrement mixed with kitchen and household refuse. When the team sorted it, the ancient diet came back to life in extraordinary detail. The residents had eaten figs, olives, grapes, walnuts, eggs, chicken, and a remarkable range of seafood, including sea urchin and many species of fish, identified from the bones and scales that passed through the human gut and settled in the pit. Robinson noted that this ordinary, non-elite population actually ate a healthier and more varied diet than anyone had expected. The pit gave up more than food. Small objects had fallen through the latrines and drains and settled in the muck. A gold ring, coins, a decorated lamp, beads, the accidental losses of daily life. And the sediment carried the eggs of whipworm and other intestinal parasites, confirming that these Romans, like the rest, lived with chronic infection. In normal circumstances, cesspits like this were periodically emptied by workers called stercorarii, dung collectors who carted the waste off to sell as fertilizer for farmland outside the town. The readings of the deposit converge on how much it reveals. As dietary evidence, it is a time capsule, one of the most detailed pictures of Roman consumption ever assembled. As a record of sanitation, it exposes the limits of Roman public health, since the parasites persisted despite the plumbing. And as a social document, it captures a working population, rather than the elite whose villas usually dominate the record. The lesson underneath the smell is a strange one. The fullest, most human portrait of an ancient town came out of a ton of what that town flushed away. Number 8. The Pompeii Fullonica urine vats. In a Pompeii workshop, a man stands waist-deep in a stone vat, treading cloth underfoot the way others tread grapes. But the vat is not full of water or wine. It is full of stale human urine, collected from the neighborhood, and this is how the Romans laundered their finest wool. The workshop was a Fullonica, a fuller's shop, and fulling was the trade of cleaning, whitening, and finishing woolen cloth. The active ingredient was ammonia, and the cheapest, most abundant source of ammonia in the ancient world was aged human urine. As urine sits and breaks down, it releases ammonia, which is a powerful degreasing agent, and it stripped the natural oils and dirt out of raw wool beautifully. So fullers set out collection jars on street corners, and passers-by relieved themselves into them, donating the raw material of the laundry trade as they went about their day. This was such a reliable stream of material that the state taxed it. When the Emperor Vespasian placed a tax on the collection of urine, his son Titus objected that it was beneath the dignity of the treasury. Vespasian is said to have held a coin to his son's nose and asked whether it smelled, and when Titus admitted it did not, Vespasian delivered the line that money does not stink, pecunia non olet, a phrase still used 2,000 years later. And urine's uses did not stop at laundry. It was also sold and used as a mouthwash and a tooth whitener, because the same ammonia that bleached a toga could bleach the enamel of teeth. The fulleries of Pompeii are preserved in remarkable detail, including frescoes that actually depict the fullers at work, treading cloth in their vats and finishing the wool. The labor was low in status and soaked in smell. The workers spent their days in the reek of ammonia, treading other people's waste into luxury fabric. It is easy to laugh at, but the chemistry was genuinely sound, and the same compound is still the backbone of many cleaning products today. The ways of reading it run along familiar lines. One is the practical chemistry, the recognition that ammonia truly is an effective cleaner and that the Romans had found a free supply of it. Another is the picture of an urban recycling economy in which a waste product was captured, taxed, and turned into an industry. A third is the class reality, the fullers standing in the vats while the elite wore the results. And the detail that makes people wince never quite fades. Romans brightened both their togas and their teeth with jars of stored urine. Number 9. The Garum fermentation vats. Walk along the coast at Baelo Claudia in Roman Spain, or past the workshops on the edge of Pompeii, and you would pass rows of open stone tanks in which fish were rotting in the sun. This was not neglect or waste. This was a factory, and what it produced was the single most beloved flavor in the Roman world, a fermented fish sauce called garum. Garum and its close relatives, liquamen, muria, and alec, was made by layering fish, often the guts and blood along with small whole fish, together with salt in open vats, then leaving the mixture in the sun for weeks or months. Enzymes in the fish and salt-loving bacteria slowly broke the flesh down through controlled decomposition into a savory liquid. The production sites, called ceteriae, survive with their rows of sunken vats at Baelo Claudia, at Pompeii, and along coastlines across the Mediterranean. Pompeii was a noted garum town, and the workshop of a producer named Aulus Umbricius Scaurus is documented there, complete with mosaics boasting about the quality of his sauce. The trade was vast. Amphorae stamped with the names of garum makers traveled the length of the empire, from Britain to the Levant. The finest grade, Garum Sociorum, was made from mackerel and could reach luxury prices, while the cheapest versions used whatever fish were on hand. And like the dye works and the fulleries, garum production stank, so the ceteria were placed at the edges of towns and along the shore. The reward was flavor. Garum was rich in glutamates, the compounds behind the savory taste we now call umami, and it added salt, depth, and protein to Roman cooking. The cookbook associated with the gourmet Apicius uses it in dish after dish, almost universally. But there was a hidden cost, because garum was fermented rather than cooked, and because it was made from fish and shipped everywhere. It is a leading suspect in how the fish tapeworm spread across the whole Roman world. The same paleoparasitologist, Piers Mitchell, linked the empire-wide trade in uncooked fermented fish sauce to the geographic spread of that parasite. When Vesuvius buried Pompeii, it preserved an actual vat of garum, carbonized but intact, still holding the bones of the fish that were fermenting in it, and analysis of that residue identified the small fish, such as anchovy and pickerel, that went into the sauce. The interpretations sit in tension with one another. As cuisine, garum was a cultural staple, the flavor of an entire civilization. As epidemiology, it was very likely a disease vector, carrying tapeworm eggs to every province. And as labor history, it meant crowds of low-status workers standing over tanks of liquefying fish. The unease at the center is hard to shake. An empire seasoned nearly everything it ate with the runoff of rotting fish guts. Number 10. The Moche Sacrificial Plaza of Huaca de la Luna. Rain is hammering the north coast of Peru, which almost never happens, and on the mud floor of a great adobe temple plaza, a line of young men is being led out to die. This is Huaca de la Luna, the Temple of the Moon, and the archaeology beneath that plaza turned a scene painted on pottery into physical, skeletal fact. The Moche civilization flourished on the Peruvian north coast from roughly 100 to 800 CE, building enormous adobe pyramids without any system of writing. Huaca de la Luna, near modern Trujillo, was paired with an even larger structure, the Huaca del Sol. Excavations led by the Peruvian archaeologists Santiago Ucheda and Ricardo Morales, and by the archaeologist Steve Bourget, uncovered a sacrificial area known as Plaza 3A. There they found the remains of at least 70 sacrificed young men. The bones carried cut marks, healed and unhealed fractures, and clear evidence of throat slitting and dismemberment. Some skeletons lay articulated in the mud. Others had been deliberately defleshed or had their bones rearranged. What made the discovery so striking was the timing. The sacrificial deposits were concentrated in layers laid down during episodes of catastrophic rainfall, the kind driven by intense El Niño events that flooded the normally dry coast and threatened everything the Moche grew. Bourget argued that these were rain and fertility rituals, desperate ceremonies to appease the gods as the climate turned violent. And the Moche had painted exactly this. Their fine-line pottery and temple murals show a scene archaeologists call the sacrifice ceremony, in which the throats of prisoners are cut and their blood is offered to elite figures, presided over by a fanged deity known as I-Apayek, the decapitator, whose image covers the temple walls in vivid color. The victims were most likely war captives, taken not from foreign enemies, but in ritual combat between Moche communities, a reading supported by analysis of the bones and their chemistry. The mud of Plaza 3A preserved the bodies so well that researchers could study the very sequence of decomposition, and the temple itself was built and rebuilt in phases over centuries, each new construction sealing older painted facades inside it. The theories circle the same disturbing center. The dominant reading is ritual appeasement, human lives offered to bring or to stop the rain. A second sees political theater, the elite displaying power over life and death. A third emphasizes climate crisis desperation, the sacrifices multiplying as the weather grew more destructive. Because the Moche left no writing, the plaza and its bones are the testimony, and they testify that a temple could become a killing ground every time the sky threatened the harvest. Number 11. The Nazca trophy heads. In a cache in the southern Peruvian desert lies a human head with no body. The brain has been scooped out, the lips are pinned shut with cactus spines, and a braided cord runs through a hole bored in the forehead, so the head could be carried or hung. It is one of more than 150 such heads left behind by the Nazca, the same culture that drew the vast lines across the desert floor. The Nazca flourished on the southern coast of Peru from about 100 BCE to 800 CE, and their trophy heads appear both as physical objects in the archaeological record and as one of the most common images in their pottery and textiles. The preparation was a careful, repeated procedure. The brain was removed, usually through the base of the skull, and a hole was deliberately bored through the frontal bone of the forehead so a carrying cord could be threaded through. The lips were pinned closed with cactus spines or thorns, and because of the extreme dryness of the Nazca Desert, many heads still keep their skin, their hair, the cords, and the very spines that sealed the mouth. For a long time, these were assumed to be the severed heads of defeated foreign enemies. But ancient DNA and isotope studies changed that picture. The analysis showed that many of the trophy heads came from the same population as the people who took them, not from outsiders. That shifts the interpretation away from simple war trophies and towards something ritual and ancestral. In Nazca art, trophy heads are shown connected to sprouting plants and growing crops, which suggests a belief that the heads carried a power of fertility and regeneration, tied to the same agricultural anxieties that shaped so much of Andean religion. The heads are frequently found in deliberate caches, sometimes dozens buried together, and osteological study shows the victims included men, women, and children. The practice ran for centuries and is one of the most consistent features of Nazca ritual life, plausibly connected to the same worldview that produced the desert lines and the underground aqueducts called puquios. Museum collections in Peru and abroad preserve many of these heads, cords, and spines intact. As with the Moche, the theories cluster and compete. One holds that the heads were war trophies after all, markers of victory in conflict. Another reads them as objects of ancestor veneration, kin transformed into sacred relics. A third ties them directly to agricultural ritual, severed heads meant to feed the fertility of the land. The distinctive, unsettling signature never changes across all of them. These were human heads engineered into portable ritual objects, brains removed, mouths pinned shut, drilled and corded so they could be carried. Number 12. The Roman Dormouse Gladiator-Blood. Inside a sealed terracotta jar, in total darkness, a small dormouse is growing fatter by the day, climbing the little spiral ledges built into the walls, feeding on acorns with no idea whether it is day or night. It is being fattened for the table, and the jar it lives in has a name, the Gladiator-Blood, a purpose-built device for turning a wild rodent into a Roman delicacy. The animal was glis, the edible dormouse, and the Romans farmed it as a luxury food, above all for banquets. The Gladiator-Blood was a clever piece of engineering. The jar had internal ledges spiraling up its walls to give the dormouse room to move, and small ventilation holes to keep it alive. But it was kept dark inside. The darkness mimicked the conditions of hibernation, so the dormouse stayed inactive and laid down fat quickly, exactly what the cook wanted. When it was plump enough, it was roasted, often stuffed with pork and pine nuts, then dipped in honey and rolled in poppy seeds. We know how it was served because Roman writers described it. In Petronius's satirical novel, The Satyricon, the outrageous feast of the freedman Trimalchio features dormice glazed with honey as a status dish, a way of showing off wealth. The cookbook associated with Apicius includes a recipe for stuffed dormouse, and the appetite for them was so pronounced that, according to Pliny the Elder, Roman censors tried to ban the eating of dormice under sumptuary laws meant to curb luxury around 115 BCE. Diners are even said to have weighed their dormice at the table to show how impressively fat they were. Surviving Gladiator jars, some with their internal ramps still intact, sit in archaeological collections today, and the practice of farming dormice for food actually persisted in parts of Italy and the northern Balkans into recent centuries. The animal is richest in autumn, when it naturally fattens for winter, which is precisely the instinct the dark jar exploited year-round. The readings of it are more cultural than mysterious. One frames it as elite conspicuous consumption, novelty food as a display of status. Another treats it as a small marvel of culinary engineering, a container designed around an animal's biology. A third places it inside the politics of Roman luxury, the sumptuary laws that tried and failed to rein in such excess. What modern stomachs catch on is the method as much as the meal. A live rodent, force-fattened in the dark inside a sealed jar, so it could be honey-glazed and eaten at a feast. Number 13. The Ostia communal latrines. Picture 20 Romans seated shoulder to shoulder on a long marble bench, no walls between them, chatting and doing business while they relieve themselves over a running sewer. And then imagine a jet of flame bursting up from one of the openings. That is not a joke. It is a real hazard of the Roman public toilet, and Ostia, the port city of Rome, preserves some of the finest examples anywhere. The great latrine at Ostia, the Foraca, seated around 20 people at once on a continuous marble bench, pierced with keyhole-shaped openings. There were no partitions and no privacy. Using the toilet was a social act, a place to talk, gossip, and pass the time. Beneath the bench ran a deep channel of flowing water that carried the waste away, and a second, shallow gutter of clean water ran along the floor at the user's feet, supplying the water to rinse the shared sponge. The system was often fed by gray water, diverted from the neighboring bath complexes, tying the whole sanitation network together. But these rooms were poorly ventilated, and beneath the seats, waste decomposed and released gases, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. Those gases could build up in pockets and, on occasion, ignite, sending flames up through the openings, a genuine and frightening danger for whoever happened to be seated there. The Romans seem to have understood the latrine as an uncanny, threatening place. They sometimes placed images of the goddess Fortuna or protective symbols on the walls to ward off the bad luck and the demons associated with the dark drains below. and those drains teemed with rats, insects, and other vermin moving between the sewer and the street. The science confirms the rest. Paleoparasitology of Roman latrine deposits finds the eggs of whipworm and roundworm in abundance, showing that the toilets did nothing to reduce parasite loads. The shared tersorium was used here, passing infection along the bench, just as at every other forica. Wealthier Romans had private latrines at home, but those were often placed right beside the kitchen, so that food waste and human waste drained together, and the home cesspits still had to be emptied by hand by the stercorarii. The interpretations pull in opposite directions and are all true at once. As engineering, the Roman public latrine was a genuine marvel of urban planning, running water and organized waste removal on a civic scale. As public health, it was a hazard, a gas-prone, parasite-ridden, vermin-infested space. As social history, it was a communal room where the business of the body was shared without shame. The image that survives is the sum of all three. Rome's proudest sanitation showpiece was a shared bench filled with gas and worms, where 20 strangers sat together over the sewer. Number 14. The rotten teeth of the Egyptian pharaohs. A god-king, the ruler of the richest civilization on earth, lies awake in agony because his mouth is full of teeth ground down to the raw pulp and swollen with abscesses. This is not a peasant. This is a pharaoh, and severe dental disease reached all the way to the top of Egyptian society, in some cases badly enough to help kill the king. The cause was hidden in the daily bread. Egyptian flour was contaminated with abrasive grit, sand blown into it from the desert, and tiny fragments of stone worn off the querns used to grind the grain. Every loaf was faintly gritty, and over a lifetime that grit acted like sandpaper, wearing the enamel off the teeth, exposing the soft dentin and then the pulp, and opening the way to chronic abscesses. Studies of royal mummies show worn-down molars, lost teeth, and severe gum disease across the dynasties. The mummy of Amenhotep III shows badly worn and abscessed teeth, consistent with years of chronic dental pain late in his life. Rameses II, the Great, who lived into his 90s, suffered severe abscesses and gum disease, and the resulting infection may well have contributed to his death. Modern imaging made the damage vivid. The Egyptian Mummy Project, led by Zahi Hawass with the radiologist Ashraf Selim, put royal mummies through CT scanners and documented the abscesses, the lost teeth, and the infections spreading into the jaw. The Egyptians themselves reached for explanations and cures. Like many ancient cultures, they believed a toothworm caused toothache, and the Ebers Papyrus records remedies for aching teeth, packs of ground minerals, honey, and herbs applied to the gums. But there is little evidence they performed surgical extractions. Treatment was mostly palliative, aimed at easing pain rather than curing the cause, with only rare attempts to bind loose teeth with gold wire. The disease was democratic in the worst way. The same grit-driven wear appears in the teeth of the workers at sites like Amarna, because everyone, king and laborer alike, ate stone-ground bread. Abscesses could drain into the jawbone and the sinus, causing the bone infection called osteomyelitis, which is visible on the skeletons. Sugars from beer and honey in the diet only compounded the decay, and because the damage accumulated with age, the pharaohs who lived longest suffered the most. The explanations are less a mystery than a convergence. The mainstream cause is dietary abrasion, the grit in the bread. A related thread treats the resulting infection as a genuine factor in the deaths of several elderly rulers. A third simply marks the limits of ancient dentistry, a medicine that could soothe, but not repair. The picture they build together is bleak and human. The god-kings of the richest civilization on earth died with their mouths full of ground-down, festering teeth. Step back from the individual horrors, and a pattern comes into focus. In almost every case, the disgust is not a dead end. It is a doorway. Sewage, coprolites, cesspits, and latrine deposits have handed archaeologists the most detailed pictures of ancient daily life we possess, from the exact diet of ordinary townsfolk at Herculaneum to the feasting habits of the people who raised Stonehenge. What we recoil from is often what preserves the most information. A second pattern runs through all of it. Sophistication and squalor lived side by side, never canceling each other out. The same Egypt that produced the oldest written women's medicine prescribed crocodile-dung. The same Rome that engineered aqueducts and public toilets shared a single sponge down a parasite-ridden bench. Literate medicine, monumental building, and chronic infection all belong to the same people at the same time. And their medicine, however logical from the inside, was blind without any concept of germs, which is how you arrive at dung pessaries, gladiator-blood, and the toothworm. There is a thread that ties food and trade to disease, visible in the Garum vats and the feasting offal that carried tapeworm across whole regions. There is a thread that binds disgust to the sacred, in the Moche Plaza and the Nazca caches, where the most horrifying acts were also the most holy. And there is the reminder that status bought no escape, since pharaohs, elites, and commoners alike carried the same worms and rotted the same teeth. The filth, in the end, is the record, and it is often the truest one we have. Some questions refuse to close. We still do not know whether any of these folk contraceptives truly worked, or how widely the drinking of gladiator blood was really practiced, or exactly where the line fell between warfare and veneration in the Moche and Nazca treatment of the dead. Each answer we recover seems to open another uncertainty behind it. There is a deeper puzzle underneath all 14. The reflex of disgust almost certainly evolved to protect us, to steer us away from decay, contamination, and disease. Yet every one of these cultures overrode it, deliberately and repeatedly, in the name of medicine or luxury or the gods. That may be the real through line of this whole grim tour. What one age files under healing or prestige or worship, another age can only file under horror, and the ground beneath us is still full of both, waiting to be dug up. If the deep past still has questions for you, there is another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.